While most of America boxes up their ornaments and tosses their dried-out trees to the curb on December 26th, deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, Christmas is just getting started. In these ancient hollers and ridges where mist clings to the mountainsides like cobwebs and time moves differently than it does in the flatlands below, the true Christmas, what folks call Old Christmas, doesn't arrive until the dark, cold night of January 5th and isn't celebrated until January 6th. This isn't stubbornness or confusion. This is memory. This is tradition so old it predates the very calendar most of us live by. Welcome back to Legends from the Holler, as we dive deep into the meaning of Old Christmas. And on the night before Old Christmas, if you know where to look and you're brave enough to stay awake until midnight, you might witness something that defies explanation. Cattle dropping to their knees in prayer, bees humming hymns in their hives, and thorn bushes bursting into impossible bloom in the dead of winter. To understand why Appalachian communities celebrate Christmas on January 6th, we have to go back to 1752, a year that, quite literally, lost 11 days. For centuries, the Western world had used the Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, but the Julian calendar had a problem. It was slightly too long, adding about 11 minutes too many to each year. Over centuries, those minutes accumulated into days, and by the 1500s, the calendar had drifted noticeably out of sync with the solar year. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a corrected calendar, the Gregorian calendar we use today. Catholic countries adopted it quickly, but Protestant England, always suspicious of orders from the Catholic Church, resisted for another 170 years. Finally, in September 1752, Britain and its colonies made the switch. To realign the calendar with the seasons, they simply eliminated 11 days. People went to bed on September 2nd and woke up on September 14th. Those days never happened. For most of colonial America, this was accepted, if grudgingly. But in the isolated mountains of Appalachia, where communities were separated by weeks of travel from the outside world, where news arrived late, if it arrived at all, and where people lived by the rhythms of seasons rather than government proclamations, the old ways persisted. To these mountain people, Christmas had always fallen on December 25th, but by their reckoning, the real December 25th was now what the new calendar called January 6th. They weren't being contrary. They were being faithful to the date that had always marked Christ's birth in their understanding. And so, Old Christmas was born, or rather, it never died. It simply refused the change. Have you ever heard of a Christmas that lasts for 12 whole days? Not just the song, but a real lived tradition? Deep in the mountains of Appalachia, Christmas wasn't just a single day on December 25th. Instead, it was a magical, mysterious stretch of time, a period from Christmas Day all the way to January 6th, known as Old Christmas or Epiphany. This was a liminal time, a space between the old year and the new, when the normal rules of the world just didn't seem to apply. For these 12 days, the air itself felt different, charged with a unique blend of celebration and deep-seated caution. It was a time for pausing, for reflecting, and for paying close attention to the world around you, because signs and wonders were believed to be everywhere. During these 12 days, work ground to a halt. It was considered incredibly bad luck to do any serious labor. Farmers wouldn't mend fences, women wouldn't do laundry, and even the spinning wheels fell silent. The belief was that any work started during this period would be cursed to fail. This wasn't about laziness. It was about respect for the sacredness of the season. The world was holding its breath, and so were the people. Instead of toiling, families turned their attention inward, focusing on home, hearth, and community. Even the animals were part of this special observance. It was a common practice to give the cattle extra feed on Christmas Eve, a gesture of gratitude and a nod to the belief that, just for that one night, animals were granted the power of human speech. Imagine the old stories whispered by the fireside of farmers sneaking out to the barn at midnight, hoping to overhear what their cows and horses had to say about the year gone by. So, what happened on December 25th, the day most of us celebrate as Christmas? For Appalachian families, it was more of a quiet beginning, a prelude to the main event. Families would gather, of course. There would be a special meal, and if they could afford it, small handmade gifts might be exchanged. But it wasn't the grand finale. The decorations, simple and beautiful, stayed right where they were. The cedar tree, brought in from the woods and strung with popcorn, berries, and paper chains, remained proudly in the corner of the cabin. The candles were kept ready in the windows, not just for one night, but for all 12. Everyone understood that this was just the start. The real holy day, the climax of the season, was still on its way. The real heart of the celebration was January 6th, known as Old Christmas. For many isolated mountain communities, Old Christmas was the true day of Christ's birth. This was the day when the veil between the earthly and the divine was said to be at its thinnest. It was a day for deep spiritual observance and for watching for miracles. One of the most beautiful beliefs was that at the stroke of midnight leading into January 6th, the elderflower bushes would burst into bloom, even in the dead of winter, to honor the Nativity. People would also watch the weather on each of the 12 days, believing that each day's weather predicted the weather for the corresponding month of the coming year. So the weather on December 26th would foretell January's weather. The 27th would predict February's, and so on. It was a way of finding order and meaning in the natural world, a folk wisdom passed down through generations. On Old Christmas Day itself, the festivities reached their peak. Communities would often have a big get-together, with music, dancing, and storytelling. But there was also a darker, more mischievous side to the celebration. Groups of men and boys would sometimes engage in serenading or shooting in the Christmas. They would go from house to house, making a racket with guns, bells, and shouting, demanding food or drink in a playful, rowdy tradition that echoed ancient European customs like wassailing. It was a way to let off steam and reaffirm community bonds before settling back into the hard work of the new year. In Appalachia, Christmas music was a loud, raucous, joyful assault on the senses. Groups of men and sometimes whole families would go serenading or rambling through the hollers, armed with fiddles, banjos, washboards, and anything else that could make noise. They'd show up at a neighbor's door at midnight, singing at the top of their lungs, sometimes firing rifles into the air, making such a commotion that you couldn't help but wake up and invite them in. This wasn't caroling for charity or Christian duty. This was celebration as survival, joy as defiance against the cold and dark. And it was expected that if serenaders showed up at your door, you'd offer them something. Apple cider, a slice of stack cake, maybe a shot of corn whiskey if you had it. The serenaders would eat, drink, warm themselves by your fire, and then head out into the night to wake up the next neighbor. This could go on all night long, and by morning, everyone in the holler would be exhausted, slightly drunk, and filled with the warm glow of community. There were no toy stores in the mountains, no mail-order catalogs that could reach the most isolated hollers. Everything about an Appalachian Christmas was made by hand, often from materials gathered from the land itself. Fathers would spend weeks in their workshops whittling toys from scraps of wood. Tiny horses, simple wagons, whistles carved from willow branches. Mothers and grandmothers would sew rag dolls from feed sacks, stuffing them with wool or cotton scraps, painting faces with whatever dye they could make from berries and roots. The Christmas tree itself was always a cedar, cut from the mountainside and dragged home through the snow. It was decorated with strings of popcorn, chains made from scraps of colored paper, and perhaps a few precious ornaments passed down through generations. At the top, instead of an angel or star, there might be a carved wooden dove or simply the natural shape of the tree itself, pointing toward heaven. These weren't symbols of poverty, but of connection. To the land, to tradition, to the understanding that the most meaningful gifts come from the investment of time and love rather than money. A hand-carved toy carried the warmth of the hands that made it. A rag doll wore the pattern of a dress your grandmother once wore. These were Christmas gifts that held memory. One of the most beautiful Appalachian Christmas traditions was the lighting of candles in every window on Christmas Eve. Both December 24th and, more importantly, January 5th, Old Christmas Eve. The practice came from an old belief that Mary and Joseph, still wandering, still seeking shelter, might pass by in the night. The candles were a signal. Here is warmth. Here is welcome. Here is a place that will not turn away the Holy Family. But the tradition expanded beyond its religious origins. A candle in the window meant that any traveler, any stranger lost in the mountain darkness, could knock on that door and find shelter. In a landscape where winter storms could kill and where neighbors might be miles apart, this was more than symbolism. It was survival. It was the understanding that we are all, at some point, strangers in need of light. Families would place their candles at dusk and keep them burning through the night. Children would press their faces to the windows, watching the small flames flicker, imagining Mary and Joseph walking through the snow, looking for the glow that promised kindness. An Appalachian Christmas feast was the culmination of a year's labor. The country ham that hung at the center of the table had been cured months earlier, rubbed with salt and sugar, hung in the smokehouse through summer and fall. The apples and the stack cake, that humble, magnificent dessert made of thin, spiced cake layers held together with apple butter, came from the family's own trees. Picked in autumn and dried or cooked down through the winter, apple stack cake was sometimes called the poor man's fruit cake, but that name doesn't do it justice. Unlike fruit cake, which required expensive candied fruits and nuts that mountain families couldn't afford, stack cake was made from what the land provided: apples, sorghum, molasses, and spices. Each layer was thin as paper, and the cake needed to sit for days, allowing the apple butter to soften the layers and meld the flavors together. The result was something dense, moist, and deeply satisfying, a cake that tasted like effort and patience. And then there was boilo, a warm punch made from citrus, honey, spices, and sometimes a generous pour of whiskey. It was served in tin cups around the fire, passed from hand to hand, warming bodies from the inside out. The recipe varied from family to family, but the purpose was always the same: to create a drink that held warmth and welcome, something that said, "You are home." Yet all of the feasting and the singing and the gift-giving, all of it was just preparation for the real holy night. The serenading, the handmade gifts, the candles, the feasting, was prelude to the real mystery of Old Christmas. And that mystery reached its peak on the night of January 5th, Old Christmas Eve, at the stroke of midnight. According to Appalachian folklore, at midnight on Old Christmas Eve, the cattle in the barns would drop to their knees, not out of fear or illness, but out of worship. People said the animals remembered. They held some ancestral memory of that first Christmas, when cattle and donkeys stood witness to the birth of Christ in a stable in Bethlehem. And once a year, at the true hour of his birth, they would kneel in prayer. Some stories claimed the cattle didn't just kneel but spoke, that if you were in the barn at exactly midnight and listened carefully, you might hear them speaking in human tongues, praising God. But there was a warning that came with this knowledge. Listening to the animals speak was dangerous. Some said it was bad luck. Others said you might hear prophecies you weren't meant to know, or that the animals might speak your own death. So most people stayed out of the barn at midnight on Old Christmas Eve, allowing the animals their sacred moment in private. But cattle weren't the only creatures touched by the holy night. Beekeepers swore that their bees, dormant in their hives through the winter, would begin to hum at midnight. Not the busy buzz of summer work, but a low, harmonic sound like a hymn. The bees were singing, they said, their own insect chorus joining the angels. Perhaps the most visually striking piece of Old Christmas folklore was the belief in the blooming bush. Elder bushes and hawthorns, sometimes called thorn bushes, were said to burst into bloom at midnight on Old Christmas Eve. Despite the snow and freezing temperatures, white flowers would suddenly appear on bare, frozen branches, lasting only until dawn, when they would wither and disappear as mysteriously as they had come. The legend connected this phenomenon to the crown of thorns. The branches that had been twisted into a torture device for Christ were believed to bloom once a year in recognition of the miracle of his birth. Some families had specific bushes they would visit on Old Christmas Eve, gathering in the cold and dark to see if the miracle would occur, and many swore they had witnessed it. The sudden appearance of white blossoms on dead winter wood, glowing in the moonlight. Scientists and skeptics have offered explanations: unusual weather patterns, misidentification of frost patterns, wishful thinking. But for the people who stood in the snow at midnight and saw those flowers bloom, no explanation was needed. They had witnessed the sacred breaking through into the ordinary world, and that was enough. In the 21st century, when our calendars are synchronized to the millisecond and Christmas is a retail season that begins before Halloween, the tradition of Old Christmas might seem like a quaint anachronism, but that misses the point entirely. Old Christmas isn't about being right about dates or clinging stubbornly to the past. It's about the refusal to let time be dictated entirely from outside. The insistence that community and tradition have their own authority, their own truth. The Appalachian people who kept Old Christmas weren't rejecting the modern world. They were choosing to live in a world where both December 25th and January 6th could be Christmas, where there was room for official time and sacred time to coexist. They were preserving a version of Christmas that was handmade, homegrown, and rooted in the actual experience of their community rather than imposed from distant capitals or shopping centers. And in that preservation, there's a lesson for all of us. Old Christmas reminds us that the most powerful traditions aren't the ones enforced by authority or driven by commerce, but the ones kept alive by people who believe they matter, who gather in the cold and dark to light candles, to sing too loudly, to watch for kneeling cattle and blooming thorns, and to insist that the sacred is still present in the world if you know when and where to look. So if you find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains in early January and you see candles burning in cabin windows, if you hear the sound of fiddles and singing echoing through the hollers after midnight, if you notice that the local folks seem to be celebrating Christmas all over again, well, now you know why. They're not late to the party. They're right on time. They're keeping faith with a calendar that predates our modern one, honoring traditions that have survived centuries of change, and maintaining a connection to a version of Christmas that's wilder, stranger, and more wondrous than anything you'll find in a shopping mall. And if you're very lucky and very brave, maybe you'll find yourself standing outside a barn at midnight on January 5th, listening to the silence, waiting to hear if the old stories are true. Just remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be experienced, believed in, and passed down. That's the real gift of Old Christmas. Not the date on the calendar, but the willingness to believe that the world still holds magic. If you're willing to wait for it in the cold and the dark, and if you remember to keep your candles burning in the window. And with that, we thank you so much for joining us here on Legends from the Holler. As we dove deep into the spirit and mystery of Old Christmas, if these stories of kneeling cattle, midnight blooms, and traditions that defy the calendar resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss another legend from these ancient mountains. What unique traditions does your family hold on to? Tell us about them in the comments below. We love reading your stories and keeping these memories alive. From all of us to all of you, thank you for watching. And whether you celebrate on December 25th, January 6th, or both, have a very Merry Christmas and a blessed New Year.